We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No delusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Jerry, find your hair, be president.
Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
All right, we're going to dig back into Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu, with getting into the portions that we discussed on our previous show that we're going to get into. But before that, Jeremy, you found a very interesting passage about another relative of Netanyahu who also goes by the name Benjamin.
Yes, I did. And by the way, I just noticed that on our intro, we have you responding to Dennis Ross. You're allowed your own opinions, but you're not allowed your own facts, which was that statement was made famous or maybe originated by Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who we were looking back at Benjamin Netanyahu's maybe crucial academic contribution to the literature advocating for the age of terror, or the war on terror, as they like to call it, in terms of terrorism, how the West can win, which is the published book that comes out of the 1979 Jerusalem conference. And Senator Moynihan has a crucial spot in that book. And so at some point we'll return to that book, but I just noticed that I'd forgotten about you. You said, I forget what you said, Greg. What did you say to Dennis? Take your own advice, Dennis, or something like that. So,
Indeed. It was Frank Gaffney who said that Henry Scoop Jackson and Daniel Patrick Moynihan are spinning in very high RPM, seeing what's happened to their Democratic Party. The reasonable Democrats of old who actually were patriotic and believed in a strong America, whatever that means.
and I can't remember whether they called Scoop Jackson the senator from Boeing. I think he was called the senator from Boeing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because he was out of Washington, yes. And even the senator from Boeing, but there's other things that he was also the senator representing that go outside of Boeing, or maybe go hand in glove with certain interests that a company like Boeing might have that were even, of course, other connections that he had.
Such as the Vanek-Jackson Amendment, which was the policy that probably really helped probably one of the key deep political operations of the Soviet Union in moving towards a post-Soviet deep state, in terms of being able to push, along with Soviet Jewish refugees and refuseniks of different types, into the United States, coupled with Russian organized crime. And then also, obviously, the intersection there of the deep state, meaning intelligence operations, right into the heart of New York City, obviously. And that's where you begin to really see the background of the whole Trump milieu, and Michael Cohen, and Brighton Beach, and Odessa on the Hudson, all of that. I don't know if it's called Odessa on the Hudson or Odessa on some other body of water, but and then that also then leads into, of course, Rudy Giuliani's key position in terms of taking down the Italian mafia, to apparently make space for the rise of the Russian mob, the Red Mafia, as Friedman called it. And the other thing I wanted to say is that even Boeing itself, the senator from Boeing, that Boeing becomes, I believe, the corporate locus that then retakes up some of these Israeli military intelligence technology companies that were given the outsourcing for the NSA's mass surveillance program post 9/11 that we touched on before, where Bill Binney basically said that these companies, specifically, we're talking about Verint and Narus, and I think it's Narus that was taken into Boeing, basically purchased and brought back into Boeing, that these two companies had been very likely unlawfully given out the back door NSA technology, and then they become the contractors for the mass surveillance of the United States post 9/11. So even Boeing itself has this other, what we might then say, the Talpiot program in the midst here. And this is the piece that I just found in Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu, where he touches directly on the Talpiot program. And this piece was actually right before the segment that we first started with, where he was explaining his twin pillar program of putting the Israeli economy on steroids via some kind of Chicago quote unquote free market program, and especially hyping up the security sector, the cyber sector, and all of that. And then the other pillar being, of course, his push towards Israel as a multipolar power. Especially, he targeted Russia and China as a way to spread the relationship, spread the Israeli technological and geostrategic influence around. And so that this is a little bit of the precursor to that section there.
Yeah, just two quick comments before we get into the section. Is that one, Scoop Jackson launched Richard Pearl's long career of whatever they call what he does, and right underneath him was Frank Gaffney. So we've talked about this, like this particular nest of hardcore neocons. Like these are the hardliners. These are like the ones that don't get talked about when you talk about Bill Kristol and David Frum, who are just like doves compared to these guys when it comes to certainly to Israel and to some of the more hardline pro-war on terror policies. But this gives me the idea that there's an approval. I mean, this I think would lend some credence to maybe some type of some type of horseshoe nest taking place, that they both, I guess, they didn't have any issues with the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and what all that was going to come about. We've talked about the influence that Pearl, along with Stephen Bryan, had through books such as The Armageddon Network, which was written back in the early 80s. So certainly, I think this lends credence to something going on there with this idea of these guys maybe being some type of like Soviet-Israeli nest of operatives to some level or another, that they both had to give their approval to the Jackson-Vanik Amendment at the very least, and maybe helped influence its Jackson co-sponsoring it. Another point was, you mentioned Russia and China with the multipolar, and Netanyahu wanted to make these pushes and stuff. And to me, it's very telling right now that the Fox News neocon Zionist narrative about Ukraine right now is that China is entering into Ukraine on the side of Russia, and how the threat to America, and we need to be so the splintering of there's a splintering going on where China now is the threat, and they're stepping into Ukraine, and it's because of American quote unquote weakness and all this that China's allowed to come in and help Russia and Ukraine. So you're seeing, like with this horseshoe in these narrative in some of these circles, that the splitting of Russia and China is like these opposites, and more on the side of like being hawkish toward China. But you can see how this would work for like a Netanyahu and this multipolar angle, that this is the narrative that's taken place here within this neocon media, that the direct threat that China poses by entering into Ukraine the way that they're presented as doing so on the side of Russia.
Yes, and I think you're correct about these hardliners. I would almost call them like very obvious operatives of espionage, of a maybe very likely industrial scale espionage. Like I don't believe we've ever heard of Bill Kristol or David Frum being accused of actually like direct espionage, of passing information directly to the Israelis, as people like Pearl and Brian have been multiple times actually. And just going back to our recent episode around the question of Syria and the framing of the 2013 attack in relationship to Yosef Bodansky, and we pointed out that he comes out of some kind of communications role in the highest levels of the Israeli Air Force. I would assert something in relationship to communications, in relationship to the bigger Talpiot program, and then directly enters into the United States, I think in the late 70s, probably 79, somewhere in there. And then where the locus of all of this is the external part of it is at JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, or they would change their name to Jewish Institute for National Security America, and that's the ex-governmental part of this nest of apparent espionage. But then inside the government, they actually create the technology transfer bureau, or I can't remember the specific nomenclature of that. And then they also help amp up and create the BIRD, the Binational Israel Research Development, that's basically uh, legalizing technology transfer to Israel to a major extent. So I think you're right that this is a much more militant group of what can be, defined as neocons. They don't just write policy papers or act as the press spokesman like Frum did. Now, Crystal and Frum are key communicators for the Iraq War. Crystal for the Project for the New American Century, heading that up, and them releasing the key white papers advocating for the Iraq War, and really giving a major head nod to a new Pearl Harbor in the run up to September 11th and all of that. So it's not like these guys are lightweight. It's just that this other crew are much more militant, and I would say are credibly accused as being industrial scale espionage operatives.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. There's a difference there. We saw it play out in the battle of Trump for being for Trump versus the never Trumpers. I mean, that's a big part of what that battle was the levels of, it wasn't that Trump was the dove who wanted to end the wars. No, it's that Trump represented the agenda narrative of the hardline war on terror proponents, as opposed to the people who wanted to ultimately have the power to wage wars and all this, and then that wanted it to be centered around American hegemony, even at the expense of the greatest ally, Israel. And so we've talked about that so much, but yeah, you're right about that. And this is a different level of hawkishness from these paleo neocons, as we call them.
All right, so we'll hop now into page 268 of Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu. All right, and he's talking about the financial side of his push, one of the major pillar to Chicago schoolify the Israeli economy. Quote, "We achieved similar results by introducing competition in public transportation, enabling private bus lines to compete with Egged, the mammoth publicly subsidized bus cooperative that reigned supreme for half a century. Passengers paid considerably less on the privatized lines and enjoyed better service. I now focused on quickly increasing the number of high-tech trained engineers and technicians in Israel's colleges and universities. The high-tech sector's growth potential in Israel would be inhibited not by financial capital, but by human capital, for the simple reason that Israel's state-controlled universities were not producing enough scientists, mathematicians, and engineers. Absent an overall market reform in higher education, only government intervention could change the situation. All Israeli universities receive substantial government subsidies and were governed by a steering committee composed of the heads of the universities and the education minister. I convened the steering committee and asked Elisha Yanai, chairman of Motorola Israel, to present a program for the rapid increase in the number of Israel's engineering graduates. Then I spoke. Quote, "Gentlemen," I said, "I have no desire to interfere in any way with academic freedom. I come from an academic family and I have the utmost respect for the study of humanities. But if, in the present state of the world economy, the government's money can be used to fund either the study of 17th century Tibetan poetry or microelectronics, then we must put it in microelectronics," unquote. The university presidents agreed. We initiated a program that ended up increasing the number of science and mathematics graduates by 50% in 6 years, including graduates from private colleges whose accreditation, I can't say that word, sorry, my government expedited. Many of these graduates had served in the intelligence and technological units of the IDF. They were used to solving problems quickly, often encouraged to cut red tape by improvising and innovating. While Israel's competitors were playing technological chess, Israeli entrepreneurs were playing technological speed chess. With this attitude, they were able to successfully carve specialized niches in the global technological market. All this meant that Israel could potentially create great economic wealth. The creme de la creme of this technological core was the military's Talpiot Hilltop Program, which culled a few dozen of the best and brightest recruits of each year's intake, trained them, and sent them on quote unquote think missions in military intelligence, the Mossad, and other branches of Israel's security and scientific agencies.
Operation Talpiot. Why is Netanyahu talking about Operation Talpiot if it's such a nothing burger?
Exactly. And why do the people who call Operation Talpiot a nothing, or they call it Operation to make fun of it rather than the Talpiot Program, and then also don't connect it with Netanyahu's proclaimed public geostrategy over many, many years in terms of how this was all escalated and his major plans. And as we've now pointed out from his own words in his own book, that the Talpiot program, which he calls the creme de la creme of this much larger technological core, uh, to basically create massive Israeli market and cyber power around the world, was coupled with the multipolar program of his geostrategy. And the people like Ryan Dawson who try to uh, poo-poo all this, they then also then end up totally lining up with the people like Scott Ritter when it comes to very serious questions about Russian intelligence and Russian compromat and Russian propaganda at mass scale, rather than just being some kind of quote unquote anti-war dissident, all of which Ritter publicly rejects. He's not anti-war. He says that specifically. Now, he was a dissident of some sort, but it looks like he's been the he's been there are parameters of compromise going back years, if not more than a decade, before Ritter became a dissident against the Iraq War. And as we pointed out, he was actually one of the maybe more aggressive warmongers in some ways against the Saddam Hussein in the late 90s. And so he has these two pathways backward where there's apparent compromise. One is one which he's basically said the FBI was just out to get him, and that's why they accused him of being involved in Israeli espionage. But he did, it's open, open on the record that he created, against the wishes of the CIA, direct relationship with Israeli intelligence, and he said it was just so that he could get the best intelligence when he was being given the runaround by the CIA in terms of Saddam Hussein. But knowing what we know now, and as you pointed out, Greg, the Reed Coverdale, the so-called naturalist capitalist,
Right.
did an interview with Ritter, and Ritter brings all this up, and Reed Coverdale, who's had multiple shows, regular shows, really, with people like Brian Dawson, who's seen as the dean of 9/11 studies and 9/11
Yeah.
in Israel for the libertarian set, and then people like Adam Fitzgerald, who's seen as the
Hmm.
the dean of the intelligence part of 9/11 truth and the hijacker background and all of that. And they've discussed Israel regularly on that show, and
Yeah.
Reed just lets it all go. And you
Right.
press him on it in the comments, and he makes a joke about it, about how it's because I'm Mossad or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, he did respond later on that because I was got more specific, and he said that it wasn't what I wanted to, wasn't on the agenda of what he wanted to discuss with Scott. And then he said something about, I think it was another response that he would be interested, that it would be an interesting conversation to have. So I mean, so he did, after the initial smart ass response of because I'm Mossad, he did, to his credit, respond in a more serious way. But I can't help but wonder um, if he was talking with somebody who he wasn't fond of, who has about a topic that has nothing to do with Israel, like at least on the surface, like support for some type of foreign policy operation. I don't think he would hesitate to bring up that person's connections to Israel, and like even if it wasn't on the agenda per se. So I mean, I think that that's a bit of a cop out, but at the same, I understand, but there's also a cop out element to that, because I mean Ritter's saying straight up that I worked with the Israelis because they seemed more serious about actually disarming Saddam than the Americans, who didn't want to.
And especially, like, since people like Ryan Dawson, who is embraced by I mean, I'm saying that it's a good, opening potentially that Reed Coverdale finally responded on point, that it's a worthy area of inquiry, it would be interesting. But the fact that Ryan Dawson he's not only the go-to for Reed Coverdale, he's also the go-to, he's, like, seen as, like, if Peter Dale Scott is like the 9/11 truth friendly Noam Chomsky, then Ryan Dawson is the 9/11 truth friendly Scott Horton for the libertarian sphere. And so he's pushed all around there. And so the combination of the fact that there has been no serious discourse around the actual literal um, clean break doctrine and how it relates to what actually went down in a different fashion in Syria than what happened in Iraq. That's been totally rejected by this whole set, because it then calls into question all this that we've been discussing in terms of the Russian participation in the fulfillment of the clean break, dirty rollback war with some destabilization components in Syria. And then the other piece that's been totally either rejected or they've gone blind to, this is this whole set that includes those 9/11 truth friendly and not, is the 11/9 operation, and the reality of a transnational espionage operation that involved Israel, that involved similar components in the United States that were behind even helping install and very likely reselect George Bush in an American context, the surrounding the CNP types, right? And then directly tied into the Middle East and Netanyahu specifically, Israel, Israeli intelligence. Now the whole Cambridge Analytica Israeli intelligence team Jorge thing is becoming very clear. We anticipated a lot of this in terms of our development of the 11/9 analysis, and it's being proven out. And meanwhile, these people, whether it's from this whole libertarian sphere to the sort of straight up Russian state media assets like the Sputnik radio and the RT and all of that, and there's a lot of tie-ins here between those crews, have all rejected all of those studies in terms of the Israel, the UAE, the Saudis, all tied back into the Kremlin and Putin, and the geostrategies of what Trump actually meant at a much bigger level, both geopolitically and also in terms of destabilizing American politics, the political warfare, chaos component of all that we're still in the midst of, even in the wake of the actual Trump years, that they all rejected that the entire 11/9 inquiry as the Trump Russia collusion conspiracy theory, and it's all bunk. And meanwhile, this helps explain going back even things that are as crucial to what should be their analysis, even if they were to reject the entire, 11/9 operation component, just the clean break stratagem in terms of Syria and carefully analyzing what went down there. And there's more to the background of Ritter that we will get into um, in future episodes. But I just wanted to point that out. And the other component of Ritter's compromat, going back decades, appears to be his time in the Soviet Union and his wife, who I think he left his previous wife for this young Russian translator who had learned, in what's known as a KGB school. And now, of course, like probably all like professional, government based translation institutions for people who are going to go into government translation were probably all KGB, right? And then this is another area we'll go into. I believe that we have found Ritter's wife's Twitter account, and it's exactly as you would expect from this doesn't seem organic or authentic, expatriate from the former Soviet sphere. This fits right into MAGA mind control, chaos warfare. And you will see that as we like go through some of her tweets.
Also, in the Reed Coverdale interview, Ritter mentioned that after he officially left the Marine Corps, he got a job working with the H.R. Heinz Company to build, I believe, ketchup factories in the Soviet Union. And then after the attempted coup in August of 1991, Heinz decided it wasn't going to do business anymore in the Soviet Union. So that's interesting. And then he said he was ready to apply for a career as a state police officer in New Mexico, and he received a call from a colonel who he had worked with in the Soviet Union about getting involved in arms inspecting. So both very interesting little tidbits of information there that could be maybe gone a little further with, especially the second one. The Heinz one's interesting too. But I think the second one, the call from the colonel he worked with in the Soviet Union about this, it just seems with everything else that's there, like that's interesting to say the least.
Very much so, Greg. I actually think both of those are very crucial data sets to explore, both leading in their own interesting direction. And I think your identification of the Soviet colonel that he had worked closely with, who then got him back into the arms control game at this key moment when he then, makes his way as the arms control guy at the key place where he tried to stop the Iraq War but failed. um, that's a very interesting thing, and especially when you couple it with the question of his, it looks like a honeypot wife. I'm sorry, it really does, and it's not just because she's of like, and I think she was born in Georgia, maybe studied in Ukraine, but Soviet sphere, working for the Soviet government as a translator, and it's just well known spycraft that you dangle the young, pretty translators at the foreigners coming in. And Ritter basically has addressed this publicly on
Hmm.
Twitter and basically said, well, she told me she was against the Soviet regime at the time, so she checks out. That was basically his
And
only. I vetted her she gave me, so she dog whistled some. I'm a dissident like you or something.
when it comes to people who aren't on like his side of like people who are critical of this, he calls it Russophobia. And then also he basically threatened a guy who I think wrote an article about him. If we meet, it will not be a very long interaction. I promise you that. So, you can take that for what it is. I mean, I take that as like yeah, I'm going to hurt you if we ever meet because you're bringing this stuff up. So take that for what it's worth.
And my personal encounter with Ritter was in the realm of 9/11 Truth and We Are Changelet, probably in 2000, probably 15 years ago or something like that. And he was very prickly and very defensive and sort of went almost silent when we started like really going in on him on the facts of 9/11 and the preparation for the Afghanistan war and the forensics of ground zero and all of that. And then the next day he did another event and he agreed to do a quick sit down interview with us at the end. And I got into some of the stuff about the neocons and the Israeli intelligence and all of that. And I did not know his deeper background at that time. And I'd like to go back to see that footage and see exactly how he responded because since then we've now found articles talking about his real relationship with Israel, and he calls Israel his good friend while he's also critiquing them and the escalation towards Iran. But there's a lot there, and it needs to be delved into, I think, in a way that's not just about sort of controversy. But what I also wanted to mention, Greg, that other interesting key fact that he talked about the Heinz Corporation bringing him for their ketchup operations, apparently in Russia at that very specific time is interesting too because we've identified there's this a series of very likely assassinations on planes in 1991. 1991 is a key year similar to 1979 in terms of these geopolitics. And we've talked about multiple times about the combination of John Tower, the key Robert Maxwell U.S. asset for, and it was Kissinger apparently who helped really hook him up with Tower, and to be able to put the backdoor Promise software, the Israeli military intelligence backdoor Promise software into the heart of the U.S. Nuclear weapons networks. And so then Tower goes down in a plane in the spring of 1991. So does Senator John Hines, right, Greg?
Yes, and John Hines' wife, Teresa Hines, went on to marry John Kerry, hence the name Teresa Hines Kerry. And it looks like she has a bit of an interesting background herself, born in Mozambique, some type of almost borderline like type of royalty. I mean, not quite, but in terms of like influence. And then is a translator at the United Nations, then marries John Hines, then goes on to marry John Kerry. So this seems to me something interesting there with that background. But Hines' widow went on to marry John Kerry after his plane crash.
Yeah, and I would say that the parameters that we just briefly saw in terms of the background of Teresa Hines Carey is sort of spooky too. It looks very quite spooky actually. And then of course then the triplicate, the troika of apparent plane, or not all of them were plane, but of course the final one was the boat assassination of the yacht assassination of Robert Maxwell. Then in November of 1991, and this is Ritter himself was pointing out. This is the year of the attempted uh, coup in Russia. So there's a lot going on there, especially now we know about the whole Robert Maxwell background tied in with the highest levels of the KGB. I would call them the Siloviki, and really that's I think what we see. Putin emerges out of that Siloviki in many ways, out of KGB operations, and then eventually comes to head the FSB after things are restructured after the fall of the Soviet Union. But it was Kroichkov there had been the head of the KGB, who Robert Maxwell was directly working with at that time. And so it's very possible that some of the assassination parameters surrounding Maxwell's death or Maxwell's assassination, very likely by a Israeli Kidon assassination squad, had something to do not just with Robert Maxwell's uh, business and economic issues that were beginning to pop up, where he even apparently began to threaten the Mossad to further fund him. But my sense is that there's also a tie into this whole question of Israel then being sort of may potentially framed up in some way in relationship to Robert Maxwell's uh, coup operations in relationship to the highest levels of the KGB that fell through. And so that 1991 year, I think, is something we'll go back to, and then we'll begin to include the death of Senator Hines in terms of what that might mean and who he might have pissed off. All right. All right. Oh, and it's not just here. Back to the text. It's not just that Netanyahu is identifying the Talpiot program. Here, I'll read this paragraph again, but you'll see it's even more personal. Okay. The quote, the creme, we're on the page 269 of Bibi by Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, the creme de la creme of this technological core was the military's Talpiot Hilltop program, which culled a few dozen of the best and brightest recruits of each year's intake, trained them, and sent them on quote unquote think missions in military intelligence, the Mossad, and other branches of Israel's security and scientific agencies. My cousin, Benjamin Machness, another Benjamin, and the last name is spelled Machnes, Machness. Another Benjamin, a former IAF pilot, was one of the founders of Talpiot. I understood the entrepreneurial promise of the program and supported its expansion, but I also knew that the full realization of Israel's technological potential would depend on a much broader economic transformation that still lay in the future. As with bus lines, reforms would have to be introduced again and again across the economy in a full-fledged economic revolution. All right, there's more here, but we'll leave that part be for now. And so you cannot dismiss the core aspect of the Talpiot program. Now, yes, it's obviously part of a much bigger, more expansive revolution, as Netanyahu calls it, and we've laid those out too. But once again, I'll say that I think that our interpretation of the Talpiot program as basically the special forces unit of this massive, multi-decades long push to make Israel a global technological and economic and ultimately diplomatic power is crucial. And because, of course, what Netanyahu's leaving out here in terms of his preserving operational security as a well-trained member of Sayeret Matkal and the reconnaissance behind enemy lines, he's not going to tell the English-speaking audience here that another piece of the Talpiot program beyond their quote-unquote think missions inside of Israeli military intelligence is the actual creation of corporations based on their technology and even their quote-unquote veterans that are then used to penetrate corporations, maybe especially in Silicon Valley in the United States, but also around the world. They're then brought in, and then some kind of functionality is turned over, and who knows exactly. I don't have the cyber awareness to know exactly what it means when something like Adalom, uh, created by a cyber security company created by multiple Talpiot and Unit 8200 veterans, is brought into Microsoft's Azure Cloud App Security. Does that give them then a backdoor access to some kind of God backdoor access to server sets and the entirety somehow of Azure Cloud, or just pieces of it? But what we do know is Microsoft more and more is identified as a major security breach. And just recently, actually, there was a story that came out that I think the Joint Special Operations Command had a server of there was non-secret. It was I think they weren't classified, but they were a whole set of emails based on Azure cloud servers that had been left public, quote unquote, by accident. Now, I'm suspicious of that. And then, as we pointed out, that it looked like they were trying to feed the Pentagon Jedi cloud directly into the clutches of very strongly Israeli military intelligence penetrated and really developed Microsoft over many, many decades in the form of especially Adalom having been brought in to the Azure Cloud App Security to head up Microsoft Azure Cloud App Security as the presentation for a contracted out Pentagon Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure Cloud was being proposed. And they won it at first, and then it got shut down apparently. Now, I don't know exactly what's going on, but obviously, Microsoft is the major player in terms of the basics of Office and email all around the corporate and public sector around the world, really. So I just wanted to point out that that's what's being left out here, probably for operational security reasons by Sayeret Matkal veteran Benjamin Netanyahu. But he talking about his cousin Machness being a co-founder of Talpiot, and directly saying that he knows the importance of this program, especially when it's fit into his larger program, I think is very, very, very telling. And I just want to do a couple little threads on this question of Israeli military intelligence, cyber, Talpiot, that connects us back to our previous episode about things like the Narus and Variant, as we pointed out before. But before we go there, remember when we did our from 9/11 to 11/9 series, one key point of entry, and this is also where we begin to get into Trump's ground zero and the question of some of the characters that were surrounding Trump in terms of real estate. It led us directly back to this infamous moment immediately prior to 9/11, when Bernard Kerik, uh, Giuliani's police commissioner in charge of all NYPD, went to Israel for some kind of cybersecurity, little small meeting of some sort. And then additionally, it appears that there were some bribes, a few $100,000 bribes that Carrick eventually got into trouble for, but years later, that probably started in that time frame. And one of the key ones was a quote unquote loan that was seen as a bribe, really, by law enforcement officials by a billionaire named Eitan Wertheimer, who we pointed out had been the head of the Jewish Agency for Israel Board of Governors, which the Able Danger Joint Command that included counterintelligence, counterterrorism units across different, both inside the military and in CIA and FBI, that were apparently tracking some of the prior moves of maybe the totality of at least the Manhattan, the New York based, the New Jersey based 9/11 operatives, let's say, that they identified the Jewish Agency for Israel Board of Governors as a key nodal point in the 9/11 operation, actually. And that would then point directly towards someone like a Wertheimer. And then when you see this Carrick relationship and all of that, it gets even deeper. And then, as we pointed out at the time, and I'll just remind us again, that in reading through Israel's Edge, the story of IDF's most elite unit, Talpiot, by Jason Gerwitz, which is the first book on the Talpiot program published, on page 24, quote, "Fortunately, the first commander of Talpiot was an indomitable personality, Dan Sharon." Same last name as Ariel Sharon. Now, I don't know if they're related, but maybe. Don Sharon. His war experience had taught him that there was a need for such a program well before the idea began taking off. On the first day of fighting in the Yom Kippur War, Egyptian warplanes fired Russian-made Kelt missiles at his base. The Kelts were precursors to today's cruise missiles, boasting pinpoint accuracy. Major Sharon saw some of the reserve foot soldiers who were on his base come up with a quick way to defeat and deceive the Celts by tapping into their Israeli radar systems that were on a similar frequency. All right, and then skipping forward here, page 25 of Israel's Edge by Jason Gewertz. Quote, Sharon was a longtime friend of Felix Dotan. They used to meet on Fridays for a spot of brandy. He was very eager to help Dotan, so when the program was finally accepted in 1978, Dotan asked him to lead Talpiot, and Sharon accepted. He had just completed his PhD dissertation at Hebrew University on, quote, the development of thinking and how one can improve his or her own thinking, unquote. I'm going to read a little bit more here because it's interesting too. Quote, in order to take the Talpiot position, however, the army had to reactivate him. They did so immediately with the higher rank of Lieutenant Colonel, Sigan Aluf, executive officer of a brigade. Sharon looked to many places for help and advice. He'd never started a military unit before. Benny Peled, former chief of the Israeli Air Force and architect of the IAF's stunning defeat of the Egyptian and Syrian air forces in the Six-Day War, offered his services. Sharon recalls, quote, Peled was always very positive but critical and cautious at the same time. He always had a very sharp mind. He said to me, listen, when you construct a bridge, you always leave a weak spot where you can destroy the bridge with one single stick of dynamite, if necessary. Maybe we are making a mistake, so don't forget. In case this program is unsuccessful, you need to get out, unquote. And then finally, now one thing I just want to point out is that I believe this is a relative of Miko Peled, the well-known Israeli anti-war, anti-occupation dissident. So that's an interesting piece. And then finally, quote, Sharon quickly discovered there would be bumps on the road, particularly in finding the super soldiers he needed for Talpiot. He discovered that he was in competition with a pre-existing elite computer and communications eavesdropping unit called Unit 8200. Its recruiters were active precisely where Talpiot hoped to attract candidates, unquote. And the reason that I bring up this Don Sharon and his key role in helping get the Talpiot program off the ground. And by the way, notice the timing again. We pointed this out before. This is another run-up to this key year of 1979. Talpiot launches, and then you have all this stuff going down geopolitically and all these operatives. And you have Netanyahu launching the Jerusalem conference and the launch, really the public launching of the modern war on terror intellectual architecture. And then you have people like Yosef Bodansky going to the United States. And then right out of that, you then see things like the development of the Jonathan Pollard spying ring. And then, as we pointed out before, then Netanyahu himself comes to New York, and that's when he apparently meets Trump for the first time, and he's doing his work at the UN, which is, for someone like that, that's a spy operation. That's a spy position, especially for someone who's already been in special forces, reconnaissance, and all of that. So another key year there, I'd say, it's backed up by the launch of the Talpiot program in finally in 1978 and going live right in that time frame. But this Don Sharon is also, I believe, the very same Don Sharon who is focused on, very briefly, in a Hadassah magazine write-up about Eitan Wertheimer called The $4 Billion Man. This is from November 2007, and talks about the Wertheimer family and their work in industrial production and industrial education, really. And then in the middle of the article, it says, quote, Wertheimer's reach extends beyond industry. On the road to Tefen is Kfar Vradim, the Rose Garden village. Set up by Wertheimer, the upscale town is a model community with an array of services Sort of sounds like a smart city or something like that, a little smart suburb experiment, doesn't it? Okay, quote back to the article. A well groomed place where even the municipal garbage dumpsters are hidden. It is home to many professionals and entrepreneurs who work at the local parks and attracts those who want to get away from the congestion of Ma'alot Tarshiha and can afford the high housing prices. An educational network that spans the entire region, also spearheaded by Wertheimer, offers mentoring for older entrepreneurs and post high school and post army vocational training. Quote, many hundreds of people, both children and adults, unquote, go through the schools each year, says Don Sharon, who became head of Wertheimer's educational services 2 decades ago. And then I'll bump down here a little bit. Oh no, I think I want to read more of this because I think this we've read this once, Greg, but I think we should return to this. I think this is crucial actually to this background here, especially as we're learning more and more about Netanyahu's direct relationship with this program too.
That's fine. I just wanted to throw one thing in that I'm not able to find anything for Benny Peled and Miko Peled. It's Miko Peled's father was Matti Yahu Peled, or Matti, and he was he was a general during the 6 Day War who went on to be a quote unquote peace activist in Israel, within the even having a seat in the Knesset. I can't find any links that Benny and Miko are related, and I'm not saying that they're not, but I wasn't able to find anything linking the two of them together. So I just want to throw that in there.
Yeah, and I haven't found that either. My sense is that this is a cousin of his dad, very likely. Um,
Very
and
possible.
because I've heard Miko Peled talk about when he really rages hard against the Israeli system, that they're I think he's talked about like cousins or uncles who, and not his dad, but because his dad sort of supports him to some extent, and but that there are uncles or cousins that really hit back hard at him, and so my sense it's in that potential part of the Peled family, but maybe
Very possible.
it may not, they may not be related, but I get a sense that they probably are. Just an interesting piece to consider, as we pointed out too, that like the high levels of Jewish Voice for Peace. Um, One of the women is married to a checkpoint technology engineer. And Checkpoint is it's a Talpiot veteran created major cybersecurity company. Probably, I think it's like probably the most major firewall company in the corporate world, I believe, Checkpoint Technology. Right. And the name of it, Checkpoint, right? It's designed straight out of, you know, it's modeled on and it's probably tested on cyber quote unquote security based upon the idea of Israeli checkpoints for Palestinians, right? And the other thing I just wanted to point out from that little piece there in Israel's Edge about what Peled had warned about is that they part of the conceptual architecture, right? And this, I'm sure, this goes way beyond Israeli military intelligence. Is to, if you're going to build a bridge, you leave a weak point where a single stick of dynamite can bring it down, right? So this is the architecture of cyber and all of that. I think needs to be thought through, especially in terms of the Talpiot program and Israeli military intelligence. This is all military intelligence architecture. So similar kinds of conceptual thinking about weak points that can be brought down with a single, stick of cyber dynamite. That would be very likely designed into their cyber versions of bridges and checkpoints and all of this kind of thing, right? So, all right. So back to this $4 billion man article in Hadassah magazine about Eitan Wertheimer, one of the key funders, the key bribers of Bernard Kerik, who's palling around in Israel just weeks before 9/11 on a cyber mission of some sort. Interestingly, that this gives the background there. All right. Quote, the network of roads, including a 4-lane superhighway up to the hills from the coastal area and a much-needed link through the mountains to Carmiel in the south, is far superior to infrastructure in other areas of rural Israel, particularly those far from the center of the country. Any improvements not directly financed by Wertheimer can be attributed to the impact of the industrialization he has brought to the area. Oh, and this is actually, this is not about Eitan. This is about his father, I think. The developments of the last 20 years may only be the start. According to Wertheimer's son Eitan, 53, who now runs the family empire, much of the money from the Iskar sale will be invested in the region. Iskar was their company that produced aerospace components. And by the way, I think Eitan Wertheimer has passed away in recent years, but I'm not sure about that. All right, quote, this is a quote. There are a lot of empty mountaintops here, unquote. He was quoted as saying in the Hebrew press. That's Eitan. Although he has said it is still too early to talk about plans for building in any particular area. Craggy and still sharp at 81, the elder Wertheimer now concentrates on making his vision of what he calls, quote, the third stage of Zionism, unquote, come true. The first stage, he explains, was establishing agriculture. Remember, Netanyahu given his propaganda to Jordan Peterson about the barren land, the barren land. They turn the deserts green. Think about the background of Arnon Milchan, Oliver Stone's executive producer for JFK, and way beyond that, nuclear supplier and weapons of mass destruction component supplier for the Israeli state. Background in agricultural technology. Greg, you wanted to say something?
Oh, Eitan Wertheimer passed away April 4th, 2022 at age 70. I found an article from the Times of Israel about his death, so he
All right.
has indeed passed away.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. So just last year. All right, so the third stage of Zionism, quote, the first stage, he explains, was establishing agriculture. The second was building the military so Israel has the capacity to defend itself. And the third is region-wide economic renewal and industrialization, making things the world needs, unquote. And so obviously we're there's some kind of bridge now, they maybe, the Wertheimers might say, right? And that's what the Abraham Accords represents. But in a way, it's very possible that that Netanyahu has run it into a dead end by sort of hyper militarizing it and hyper Chicago schoolifying it and the sort of so-called privatization. I get the sense that they're in the sort of loot and pillage thing that we ran up against in the United States in terms of this approach, the military industrial complex that eventually steals the actual productive capacity of the scientists and the academics and the engineers and the industrialists, combined with the looting and pillaging of the public sector, to where eventually you actually have bridges that just fall down without a stick of dynamite, or rails that are responsible for 1,000, derailments and accidents every single year. And so I think they are at a difficult place here, but the Abraham Accords represents their attempt to move into this regional approach, right, where they're supplying things that people need, but it's basically at this point, there's some civilian sector stuff. They supply some medical technology, agricultural technology, consumer technology, stuff like that. But the center of it is still military intelligence technology, cyber. Some of that's under the guise of civilian. All of it's actually not all of it, but most of that is under the guise of civilian technology in terms of firewalls and checkpoints and all of this kind of stuff, or even Microsoft Cloud, right? That's not seen as a military component, but it's very likely is Israeli military intelligence thoroughly threaded, landscape. All right, just a little bit more of this. Back to the article. Okay, so quote, The third is region-wide economic renewal and industrialization, making things the world needs. Quote, a basic problem of traditional Jewish society, says Wertheimer, of a widower with 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren, quote, was that people knew things, but they did not know how to make things, unquote. His long-term goal is to create an economic powerhouse that enriches the entire Middle East for Jews as well as Arabs. Quote, if we don't help our neighbors, we will create envy. But if we show the Arabs how to be part of the world, to sell products in Japan and buy in America, the commerce and global thinking we create will be tools for people to work together, unquote, says Wertheimer, who outlined his ideas for what he calls a, quote, Middle East Marshall Plan, unquote, in a speech to the United States Congress in 2002. And then and that we should go look for that, actually, that speech.
Yeah,
Key
imagine
timing.
we could find that on C-SPAN, and maybe Scott Ritter's testimony to the Senate, the one he keeps citing about how belligerent Joe Biden was to him at the time. So imagine both of those might be on C-SPAN. We'll have to look for them.
Yeah, and this is the same year. Isn't this the same year that Netanyahu is in Congress?
Yeah,
He always
Netanyahu was
forgets to mention this, but he was in Congress
right
representing the entirety of Israeli thinking on Iraq.
before he forgot what year the Iraq War began, with Ron Dermer sitting behind him, who
No, but
also was a serious figure in
11-9
the
operator.
around. Also, Natan Sharansky co-wrote his book. So
Good. Thank you for continuing to remind me of that, Greg. And people might want to go look at that Netanyahu haranguing of the U.S. public in the Congress. It's very telling. He's on a mission. It's sort of similar. It's like him as a reconnaissance special forces officer rather than Netanyahu storming the Capitol more as a prime minister diplomat type during Obama. And it's very psychologically aggressive. I imagine he got coached too after that too, in terms of how to present himself to an American audience, potentially too. Okay. Quote, people are dangerous when they have nothing to lose, he says. To this end, he has established an industrial park at Gebze, Turkey. Plans for similar parks in Jordan and near Rafah on the Israeli-Palestinian Authority border have been sidetracked by politics. Quote, someone told me that Wertheimer had made an accounting that if you take 40 dunams of olive trees, you can with difficulty support one family, unquote, says Sharon, who served as Director General of the Education Ministry and was a founder of the Israeli Army's prized Talpiot Technology Development Program. Quote, but if you take 1 dunam of industry, you support 40 families, unquote. And then it goes into their background. And I guess that means then you can then bulldoze the 40 dunams of olive trees that belong to the Palestinians as long as you give them 1 dunam of industry per se. And this, of course, is like one of the major talking points of the anti-BDS Hasbara network, is that you'll just be hurting the Palestinians who work in the Israeli economy or something like that. And of course, that was what the quote unquote peace deal that Kushner put forth is all based on, is some kind of economic carrot for the Palestinians, and then the Abraham Accords, or some kind of quote unquote peace deal also, but it's really just an economic free trade zone of some sort, and mainly a way of spreading backdoor technology that then, to their Arab neighbors in a way that cements their geopolitical and diplomatic relationship. And I would say, like, similarly to the idea of you know, in the mob, when you get, you do a murder or you jump somebody or something like that, that then becomes the thing that brings you all together, and the secrecy around that is the tie that binds. I sort of think that the 11-9 operation, especially as much as we know now in terms of highest levels of the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Israelis and the Egyptians, and then the Kremlin, that was sort of like the that kind of mob hit that they are now all sworn to secrecy about. And so that's going to also create some strong binding power there, I think, too. So, especially when you have people like these alleged public intellectuals and peace activists and truth activists who deny that even something like 11/9 happened. That's they end up being assets of this whole operation. All right, so we'll include the link to this article in our show notes.
With friends and allies who deny 11/9, who needs enemies?
Yeah. And by the way, this whole Carrick 9/11 Wertheimer thing, Carrick is not just some schmuck, dude. Obviously, he's in the key place. He's the ground zero police guy with the biggest civilian police intelligence unit in the world. I think the NYPD, closest connection with Israel. But then also Bush nominated Carrick to become the Homeland Security czar. But then he withdrew allegedly about not paying taxes on his housekeeper or something like that. But meanwhile, in the background here, and I'm going to read one paragraph from his militaryhistory.fandom.com biography. Yeah. Remember also, right, Greg, he was also running helping run Iraq after the invasion.
Right. Yeah. That would have
And then
been
yeah.
Carrick and Bremer, right? Carrick and Paul Bremer, who missed work on September 11th and did an interview blaming bin Laden.
We should do a meme of all the guys who missed ground zero on 9/11.
Yeah.
It's not that many, but it's a key little grouping there. And Bremer, Kissinger associates, and then also, missing. He was where Marsh McLennan. Was he Marsh McLennan on 9/11?
I believe
Greg?
so, which was
Yeah.
One of the Greenbergs. I forget which one. Was it Joel Greenberg?
Yeah, it was there was this one of the sons of Hank Greenberg of AIG, and it belonged to AIG. And as did Kroll, by the way, right? Jerome Hauer, the security, the human side of the World Trade Center security taken over by Kroll during the 90s and ramped up there in the approach to 9/11. Then, of course, you have John O'Neill, the FBI guy, key to looking at some of these previous alleged Al Qaeda attacks around the world, even things like where he seems to be being shut down by the ambassador to Yemen, Barbara Bodine, when he began looking at the USS Cole attack, and then he gets this nice cushy job for Kroll in the World Trade Center, and then ends up dead. And he seems to be he's probably the major U.S. intelligence source for the book on Robert Maxwell, Israel's super spy. And probably the one who gave a lot of the information that connected Maxwell to the Mogilevich network and into the KGB and all that, and also with the Israelis. So that's a key piece of it. All right. So this is Carrick, one paragraph of Carrick's bio on military history. Quote, state and federal investigation, federal indictment and conviction. After an 18-month-long grand jury investigation conducted by the Bronx District Attorney's Office, Carrick pleaded guilty in Bronx Supreme Court on June 30th, 2006 to 2 ethics violations, unclassified misdemeanors. Carrick acknowledged that during the time he was Interior Minister of Iraq, he accepted a $250,000 interest-free quote-unquote loan from Israeli billionaire Eitan Wertheimer and failed to report it. Carrick first met the billionaire, whose vast holdings include major defense contractors, when Carrick took a 4-day trip to Israel less than 2 weeks before September 11th, 2001, to discuss counterterrorism with Israeli officials. On November 8th, 2007, Carrick was indicted by a federal grand jury in White Plains, New York, on charges of tax fraud and making false statements to the federal government about the $250,000 he received from Wertheimer. Prosecutors further accused Carrick of receiving about $236,000 from New York real estate mogul Stephen C. Witkoff between 2001 and 2003. Some of the New York charges were dropped in December 2008, but Carrick was then re-indicted on the same charges in Washington, D.C. And there's more there, but we'll include this link too. And then finally, before we finish up the last little two segments in Bibi My Story, before I have to return it to the Lawrence Public Library, just wanted to point out these interesting little pieces here in terms of these Israeli military intelligence companies. And this is from The Shadow Factory by James Banford, the ultra-secret NSA from 9/11 to the eavesdropping on America. We'll include some links that have parts of these the information in this book in articles that have been published. But there's the key chapters that cover this Israeli military intelligence outsourcing and their involvement in it are wiretappers and techno tyranny. So on page 244. Okay, I'm going to actually go back to the very end of page 243. This is in the chapter Wiretappers in James Banford's The Shadow Factory. Quote, retired Brigadier General Hanan Geffen, a former commander of Unit 8200, noted his former organization's influence on Comverse, which owns Verint, as well as other Israeli companies that dominate the U.S. eavesdropping and surveillance market. Quote, take NICE. Just a reminder, that was the company that I had found a press release from 2008, I think, that had increased their relationship of the communications relationship, probably sensor network of Norfolk Southern. And just beginning to think about the parameters of the East Palestine, Ohio industrial tragedy, I guess we could call it for now.
And Converse's Kobe Alexander, who I believe was pardoned by Trump, who also pardoned Bernard Kerik, right? I mean,
Yes.
only the best people around Donald Trump at all times.
He's protecting the real patriots, the real heroes from the American deep state.
Right. And Carrick is just a patriot who's concerned about the left and Antifa taking over his country. That's all.
And I believe Converse was one of the companies that was involved in the question of the White House rewiring in the 90s during the Clinton administration that we touched on recently. All right. But I think it's a good point, Greg, the Kobe Alexander pardon. That was fairly early in the Trump years, and it was a crucial indicator, I think, of who exactly Trump owed some loyalty to. All right. This is retired Brigadier General Hanan Geffen's quote. Quote, take NICE, Converse, and Checkpoint, for example, three of the largest high-tech companies which were all directly influenced by 8200 technology, unquote, said Geffen. Quote, Checkpoint was founded by Unit alumni. Converse's main product, the logger, is based on the unit's technology, unquote. So again, I'll just point out all of this so-called civilian sector, corporate, Forbes 500 technology that's used by corporations all around the United States, all around the world. This is Israeli military intelligence technology. Keeping in mind the question of backdoors and the weak point designed into a bridge to take it down with a stick of dynamite, okay? And of course, Netanyahu's much larger and a well-explained plan to use this kind of technology. And of course, I'll point out again that the part that Netanyahu will not disclose publicly for operational security reasons is that the other side of this is not just that it creates economic power and economic influence and diplomatic relations internationally for Israel, but it also creates points of weaknesses, potential targets. We might call it kill switch diplomacy on the backside for Israeli military intelligence. And he's not going to tell you that openly, but that's non-controversial. All right. Bottom of page 243 of The Shadow Factory by James Bamford. Quote, Checkpoint, a large Israeli-based company that sells firewalls and other internet security software from an office in Redwood City, California, was founded by Unit 8200 veteran Gil Shwed. Today, the 4 years he spent in the unit go virtually unmentioned in his official biography. In 2006, the company attempted to acquire the firm SourceFire, whose intrusion prevention technology is used to protect the computer assets of both the Pentagon and NSA. Because of the potential for espionage, the deal set off alarm bells at the NSA and FBI, and it was eventually killed by the Committee on Foreign Investments in the U.S. and Oversight Board. Alan T. Sherman, a specialist in information assurance at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, noted the potential for, quote, information warfare, unquote, was likely. Quote, it's easy to hide malicious software code. Sometimes it just takes a few lines of malicious code to subvert a system, unquote. Nevertheless, despite the fact that many of the NSA's and the Pentagon's sensitive communications, like those of the rest of the country, travel across the tapping equipment of Verint and Narus, their links to Israel seem to have slipped below the radar. All right, and there's a whole bunch here. I just want to skip ahead to Narus. Remember, this is the company, one of the two key companies that was, according to Bill Binney, the technology was handed over. So something in the realm of the technology transfer crew, or people like Pearl who've been accused of handing over information to the Israelis. So somewhere in this network that has been credibly accused of this kind of espionage over many years, handed technology to the Israeli military intelligence that eventually became two companies, Narus and Verint, that were the key companies for then wiretapping the entirety of American telecommunications in the post 9/11 era. All right, bottom of page 245. Quote, similar to Verint, Narus was formed in November 1997 by 5 Israelis, with much of its money coming from Walden, Israel, an Israeli venture capital company. At the time, most of the founders were working for the Israeli company VDONet, which specialized in live video broadcasts on the internet. Based in the Israeli city of Herzliya, the company also had offices in the Silicon Valley town of Palo Alto, California, not far from where Narus planted its flag in Mountain View. Among the 5 was Stanislav Kirmin, a husky bearded Russian who earned degrees in math at Ukrainian universities from 1980 to 1988. The next 4 years of his resume are blank. So that includes the interesting 1991 year too, right? But it also includes the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the key moves made by the Siloviki network in terms of transferring deep state Soviet power to a post-Soviet Russian global state apparatus. And that is that Maxwell Mogilevich. That's the underside of it. That's the organized crime and the oligarch side of it. But there's also an intelligence side that was transferring its power over to a post-Soviet network. And so included in that, right, is the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but also the 1991 key year of the dissolution of John Tower, Robert Maxwell, and John Hines, too. All right. But this is an interesting missing time for this Kirman, a husky bearded Russian who earned degrees in math at Ukrainian universities from 1980 to 1988. The next 4 years of his resume are blank. But in 1992, he began working for Elta Systems, Incorporated, a division of Israel Aerospace Industries Limited. Elta specializes in developing advanced eavesdropping systems for Israeli defense and intelligence organizations. At Narus, Kierman became the chief technology officer. All right, this is an interesting little piece here, and we'll get into more of this later. But I just want to point out that the guy goes from studying at Soviet Ukrainian universities in mathematics throughout the entirety of the 80s, and then his resume goes blank for 4 key years, and then he pops up at the heart of the Israeli aerospace defense industries, working on advanced eavesdropping systems, and then becomes the Naru's chief technology officer, the CTO. This sort of reminds me of the guy that Alan Dershowitz said one of the Epstein Maxwell victims had mistaken him for.
Nathan Myhrvold.
Nathan Myhrvold. Go look at the background of Nathan Myhrvold and the trips to Russia too with Epstein. And so this is who became the CTO of one of the two key companies where the U.S. NSA technology had been apparently uh, trucked right out the back door. Then they're stood up, and then they become our go-to for mass surveillance of the entire American telecommunications system immediately following the 9/11 big wedding, unexpected to all, perfect operation that Netanyahu himself was going to be very good for Israel.
Well, not actually very good for Israel per se, but very good for Israel, but not in that.
Very good for our relations with the United States. It'll be a blood brothers kind of bond.
That would be interesting if that quote that was attributed of Fink's bar about America could also be verified in coordination with that September 11th Good for Israel quote. That would be very interesting. I don't know if it can be, but yeah, that would say the least.
And supposedly that Fink Barr's quote came in the wake of a successful operation to covertly steal five key NSA maybe code technology transmitters, and he was sort of bragging. Apparently, that's where that infamous quote from Fink's Bar comes from. I think it was sometime in the 90s. So we should go look a little bit more into that. That quote is not well fleshed out in terms of exactly who heard it, but it's so exact that it seems like the kind of thing Netanyahu might say when he thinks he's not being exposed to public ears. We'll see, but that's a good point, Greg.
Yeah, there would be a correlation in time period with the touch football games going on between Vladimir Putin, Daniel Rohrabacher, Scooter Libby, among others, in Washington, D.C. in the early 90s.
Oh my gosh. All right. Now let's head just back into these two fairly brief but I think important pieces of Bibi My Story by Netanyahu. This is towards the end of the book. All right. So this first piece is gonna be in 2016. And he first is talking about all right, here we go. They're talking about swaps. All right, here we go. All right. I'm gonna start on top of page 546. Oh, he's describing his when he 2000 October 1st, 2015 address of the UN General Assembly when he stopped his speech and remained silent. I'm going to spare us all the his retelling of that whole thing. All right, but this is about that time here. Top of page 546. Quote, "A few days earlier I had voiced the same message in Moscow. Putin didn't particularly care about any action we took against Iran or its proxies in Syria, but he did care about the safety of his own military forces on Syria's soil, in its airspace, and especially its naval facilities in the Syria port of Latakia on the Mediterranean. The last thing Israel needed was a military clash with Russia. Once, in the crowded skies of Syria, our pilots nearly clashed with Russian pilots when we sent the IAF to destroy Iranian and Hezbollah military targets on Syrian soil. Hezbollah. We tightened the screws on a deconfliction mechanism we had been refining between our armies to ensure that our forces would not clash inadvertently with each other. At different times, I brought to these coordination meetings in the Kremlin Israel's chief of intelligence, IAF commander, and the IDF chief of staff. Putin had their Russian counterparts present, too. We set up a hotline between the IDF and the Russian Forces Command in Syria, just to make sure there were no miscommunications. We put native Russian speakers on our end of the line. By the way, I just want to point out that this is a pretty high-level grouping here that Netanyahu brings to his meetings in the Kremlin, and so you can imagine that this is the public conversation that's being shared about their deconfliction regime in Syria. What other things are being talked about in terms of the military intelligence geopolitical tip that the reconnaissance officer is protecting his operational security about?
And let's also remember that between September 2015, the official Russian entry into Syria, and I believe early 2019, I believe in that 3+ year time period alone, that Netanyahu and Putin had been attributed to have met more than a dozen times. And I mean, if this was any American leader or Western European leader, I think it would be a major scandal certainly within the quote unquote alternative press that's always so critical of Zionism and Israel and all this. But these types of meetings are going on over a dozen times in a 3-year time period. And I wonder also when the timing of the meetings around the infamous Helsinki summit, where not only Trump and Putin, of course, were making all this great relationship together, but Trump had specifically mentioned that it was a very good meeting for Israel, and so I wonder,
Putin, he loves Bibi. He loves Bibi.
Somewhere between 12 and 16 meetings in this 3-year time period. I would say those should be much more scrutinized than they would be. And if it were Americans or Western, then they would be way more scrutinized. But since it's Russia, I guess it's okay because Russia's keeping Israel in line or whatever.
Good points, Greg. All right, so we're on page 546 of Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay, so he's brought the Israelis chief of intelligence, IAF commander, and IDF chief of staff to the Russian meetings. We put native Russian speakers on our end of the line. Quote, a few days after my visit to Moscow, just ahead of going to New York for my speech at the General Assembly, I went to Washington for my customary meeting with Obama at the White House. He had 1 year left in his second term. The tension between us had subsided somewhat. We had settled into a routine in which each of us had staked out our positions. He had passed the JCPOA agreement with Iran, and I criticized it and vowed to do everything to roll it back and defend Israel against its consequences. There was no point belaboring our differences over the Iran agreement. Obama was still intent on pushing for a Palestinian-Israeli deal. Most plans for a final settlement envisioned Israel trading unpopulated territory in its pre-1967 borders for populated Jewish areas in Judea and Samaria. While not agreeing to the size of the quote-unquote swaps, the delineation of the final borders, and the allocation of sovereign powers, I offered a conceptual twist that could introduce some flexibility into future negotiations, a 3-way swap. This idea was not new. Why not throw it back in the mix? It was better than a unilateral Palestinian state on the 1967 lines, which was something that I feared Obama would try to pass in a UN Security Council resolution before he left office. I raised this 3-way swap proposal in the Oval Office. What if Israel stepped the Sinai border fence back into Israeli territory by 1 kilometer or 2, all along its 200-kilometer length? That would provide Egypt 200 to 400 square kilometers, which you could then give in equivalent territory to crowded Gaza, assuming the Palestinian Authority would one day replace Hamas. A similar swap could be made along Israel's 200-kilometer eastern border with Jordan along the Arava Valley. Jordan could then offer the Palestinians an equivalent amount of territory east of the Jordan. These swaps along Israel's two long borders would give the Palestinians additional territory while enabling Israel to keep valuable strategic lands within Judea and Samaria and maintain the Jewish communities and the biblical sites in the heart of our historical homeland. Secretary of State Kerry thought the three-way swap was worth a try, and Obama agreed. 3 months later, in February 2016, I secretly met Jordan's King Abdullah, Egypt's President el-Sisi, and Secretary Kerry in Aqaba. Unquote. Just real quickly, this, I believe, is after, right? This is after the yacht summit. This is after they'd already started having a meeting of the minds, the conspiracy to for the 11/9 operation. I believe. Right, we're heading into like the heart of the 2016 campaign. This is the moment when Arthur Finkelstein is a key character in helping drive Trump through the difficult part of the primaries and into the heart of the mainstream Republican Party. This is also beginning to approach the time where the Russians and Israelis and the Saudis and the Emiratis are going to begin to get directly invested and involved in the 11/9 campaign operation. So that's the covert history that's running parallel to all of this of Netanyahu sort of humoring Kerry and Obama, I would say. All right. We are on middle of page 547 of Bibi by Netanyahu. And remember, they're meeting with el-Sisi, who el-Sisi is also apparently read into the 11/9 operation. And actually is a key connector in terms of what Flynn is up to, actually.
And CC, who Dana Rohrabacher and Tulsi Gabbard met with in the immediate aftermath of the November 2015 Paris Angels of Death concert terror attack, I believe.
Wow, I forgot about that, Greg. Thank you for reminding me of that. Wow. All right, very interesting. Okay. Quote, Secretary of State Kerry thought the three-way swap was worth a try, and Obama agreed. 3 months later, in February 2016, I secretly met Jordan's King Abdullah, Egypt's President el-Sisi, and Secretary Kerry in Aqaba. Pleasant though the meeting was, the idea didn't get off the ground. When push came to shove, neither Abdullah nor el-Sisi would agree to it. There was an eerie feeling in these collective meetings. Whenever I met with el-Sisi discreetly in Sharm el-Sheikh and with Abdullah in Amman, the talk was much more open and frank. But in the presence of our quote-unquote American uncle, they reverted to traditional Arab positions that left little room for creativity. Neither leader wanted to be exposed before his own people, let alone before another Arab leader, ceding on territorial negotiations with Israel of any sort. This, of course, didn't prevent cash-strapped Egypt from selling 2 islands in the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia in 2016. I hadn't heard about that. Though we knew we were making progress in our relations with the Arab world, there was still a ways to go. Coming back from Aqaba, I decided to hold a primary in the Likud party to minimize internal strife in the party over the next few years. I insisted on holding direct democratic elections among the Likud's 120,000 registered voters for Knesset candidates and for party leader. And I didn't want to mirror most other parties, which had shifted to one-man rule and eliminated party primaries. Lapid and Lieberman, for example, named themselves as heads of their Knesset lists and appointed the list members without any party electoral body choosing the candidates. This didn't prevent them from castigating me as a dictator. But this time, no opposing candidates emerged to challenge me. It was the most unsatisfactory victory I had, but it saved the party more than $1 million. In May 2016, Lieberman finally decided to join the government as defense minister, giving the coalition a comfortable and secure majority. I breathed more freely. It seemed I now had a clear horizon of governance for the next 4 years. But it was not to be. The press was rife with rumors of a police investigation that would soon open up against me. For the
Fake news, fake news, fake news, fake news.
Israeli deep state trying to get the great man Bibi.
Remember, when they come for Netanyahu, you know they're coming for Trump.
He said that. Alex Jones said that. Alex Jones was right. Oh, okay. What a dope. Okay. Well, worse than a dope. All right. So there's a lot going on here, right? If you wrote down all these parallel timelines, you'd have one that was tracking what's now become public. He calls it a secret meeting, right? The private diplomacy that he was basically, I think, humoring, sort of fronting that he was open to it, and that Al-Sisi and Jordan were just rejecting it because of the American uncle in the room, maybe, but we now know El-Sisi was very likely already read into the 11/9 operation that was basically going to route around any of this. Don't worry, we'll replace this whole scenario with our Trump guy. He won't make us do this. And and that's all running at the same time as Netanyahu's domestic politics stuff is going on, and the rise of the multiple corruption cases against him. And then the third parallel timeline, which is still semi-covert to this day. It's not fully admitted by Netanyahu, although he let some of it slide, as we pointed out before, in terms of this meeting it may have been on a yacht. He said the Arab leaders contacted me after I stormed the Congress in 2015. We may have had a meeting on a yacht that my security advisors told me I shouldn't do, or it may have been somewhere else. It sort of sounded like Donald Trump talking about the hackers. It may have been Russia. It may have been some 400-pound guy in his mom's basement or something like that. But the part of this that's still semi-covert, and definitely the 11/9 conspiracy not admitted to by Netanyahu, is this the actual timeline of the 11/9 operation that's going on parallel to all of these more open diplomatic meetings that are happening. And remember that part of that is because it's illegal. It's an illegal It's illegal under U.S. law for these foreign leaders to be using cutouts, using intelligence, using corporate connections, using their agents of influence in the United States in a direct way that's directly interfering with the American election. So this is partially why they haven't admitted it. Because all Netanyahu really admitted in terms of the yacht affair, in terms of the he was talking about the Emiratis and the Saudis mainly, MBZ and MBS, I think, approaching him after he took on, the United States in the Congress under Obama. All he really admitted to was the beginning of the talk about the Abraham Accords, really, of like solidifying it, of this sort of let's uncloak our covert diplomatic and technological relations and escalate it and make it a thing. So he hasn't admitted, because I think it's because it's illegal under U.S. law, to the actual 11/9 operation that was also very likely being discussed and then put into operation, while all of this other stuff that's not illegal, diplomatic conversations, not illegal under U.S. law. Okay. All right, we are on page 548 of Bibi by Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, the press was rife with rumors of a police investigation that would soon open up against me. For the next 6 years, I would be subject to successive outlandish and politicized investigations. Since I was winning one election after another, many believed this was the only way to remove me from Israel's political scene.
It's just like Trump, except for Netanyahu has emotional stability and he doesn't come off. It's if Trump wasn't a total outlandish, egomaniacal buffoon is what Netanyahu is basically saying here. Is it's Trump minus the buffoonery. Oh, this is all fake news, and this is all just out to target me because they can't stop me from winning. It's Trump without the egotistical buffoonery, basically.
You're right. I mean, this is it's like if Trump had been a special forces reconnaissance officer, had been trained as a special forces reconnaissance officer with a lot of like media training as a diplomat, for example, rather than sort of a gold toilet owning billionaire, pseudo billionaire narcissist turned into a TV star by Jeff Zucker, then yeah, Trump would probably sound like Netanyahu. He'd be a little bit more together with it. All right, that's the end of that little section. Now there's a final section here. Comes back to Russia in relationship to Syria and Obama. All right. Bottom of page 548 of Bibi by Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, in June 2016, Putin invited Sarah and me to Moscow for the 25th anniversary of the reestablishment of relations between Russia and Israel. A few decades earlier, we were shooting each other's planes over the skies of Suez. Now we were coordinating on how not to do so over the skies of Syria. This event marked another great change. In the decades since the fall of the Soviet Union, 1 million Russian speakers had migrated to Israel, forming the largest community of Russian speakers outside the former Soviet Union. Unquote. By the way, one of them was the husky bearded Russian Kerman, who became the chief technology officer of the key NSA outsource surveillance technology company, Narus, with the missing 4 years on his resume. Okay. All right, but that you know, think about how many different instances of that kind of similar spooky question mark characters who end up in these key roles in key technology companies, let alone inside of like actual in the Israeli military too. So this is a major merger of some sorts that goes way beyond just sort of Russian speakers, voters, and the influence on Israeli politics, although that's also crucial. Okay. Quote, this event marked another great change. In the decades since the fall of the Soviet Union, 1 million Russian speakers had migrated to Israel, forming the largest community of Russian speakers outside the former Soviet Union. These Russian-speaking Jews, whose release had been at the heart of our conflict with the former Soviet Union, now formed a cultural bridge between Israel and Russia. Even before their arrival in Israel, we who grew up in Israel were well familiar with Russian songs from World War II and from the Komsomol, the Soviet youth organization that had been turned into Hebrew folk songs. Interesting. Our Russian host put up a production to celebrate these common bonds through music. A succession of Israeli and Russian artists sang the songs on stage. Putin and I then went on stage to thank the artists. When we joked about where Russian Jews should live, I blurted, quote, may the best economy win, unquote. Putin didn't seem to mind. I wonder why. Later, I asked him to help us retrieve the remains of Israeli MIAs scattered in Syria. His forces succeeded in finding the remains of IDF soldier Zachary Bomel, who had fallen in the 1982 Lebanon War. Zachary's family and the entire nation were grateful. Baumel was buried on Mount Herzl in 2019, 37 years after his death.
I believe, Jeremy, and I'm going to look into this to get the details on this, but I believe this was considered like a big campaign booster for Netanyahu, the returning of these dead Israelis by basically by Russia.
Yep, you're right. I think you're right. That was like it was a major thing that Netanyahu touted about this constructive relationship was escalating with Putin.
And the also coincides with the re-election posters of Netanyahu, I believe, with Trump and Putin respectively.
Very interesting. All right. Final little piece of this chapter. Page 549 of Bibi by Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, Given our successful cooperation in avoiding an Israeli-Russian clash in Syria, I decided to be frank with Putin. I told him I expected that Obama would bring a strong anti-Israel resolution to the Security Council in the 2 months between the end of his second term and the inauguration of the next American president. Such a resolution could ultimately lead to sanctions against Israel's economy and would undermine our security. Given reports I had heard of Obama's pledge to Mahmoud Abbas that he would recognize a Palestinian state before he left office, and with the American president soon to be free of any electoral considerations, I thought a move against Israel was inevitable. To protect the interests of my country, I could only hope that Putin would use his influence to delay or prevent such a move. Putin heard me out. What he would do about it remained to be seen.
And this brings me back to a show we did in the summer of 2021 where we read an article that was published in the Israel Hayam website. I believe we also may have gotten it from another Israeli source, but Israel Hayam is what immediately popped up, titled How Russia Saved Israel from Palestinian State Based on 1948 Borders. It was published on June 15, 2020. And this article took comments that Netanyahu had made at a public event, and then also, I believe, were made privately, and published this about exactly what Netanyahu was referring to. And we're going to circle back to here in a minute about this, the fear that the Obama administration was going to give this parting shot to Israel, and his fears being realized in the form of talk of this resolution where the border of setting up a Palestinian state based on these borders. And so I just wanted to bring that up, this program we did in the summer of 2021 surrounding this article now that once again is being referred to here in the book, Bibi, My Story.
And just before we move into this next little section, I just want to point out, Greg, that in a similar kind of way that the anticipation of 9/11 was at a crucial moment of crisis in many ways for Israel and especially Netanyahu's plan to supercharge the Israeli economy, which was actually in a very rough spot, right? And that was they sort of the geoeconomic crisis moment, I think, for Israel. And then you have 9/11, and then subsequent to that, it's that part of the plan that also includes then obviously clean break wars and all of that very overt stuff, but then this more covert plan at the time to use the war on terror to supercharge Israel's cyber and terror security and counterterrorism sectors to grow its economy and grow its political influence. I think there's a geopolitical mirroring of this in terms of a potential crisis moment for Israel politically, geopolitically, in terms of Netanyahu anticipating this would be a major move by an American president to really to like step out of the long term line at the UN of just sort of being Israel's the veto partner of some sort to actually like push for an internationally legal structural beginning of a resolution to the question of the Israel-Palestine quote unquote conflict, right? And so then you get 11/9. I think that politically resolved that crisis and in many ways supercharged Netanyahu's political power globally, obviously. There's other parts of this book where he talks about, his relationship with Orban and different European leaders, and then China and Russia more intensely, and all of that. All of that gets supercharged in the wake of the 11/9 operation. I would say in a similar kind of way that this economic piece of Netanyahu's plan was supercharged post 9/11. So I would just sort of point out structurally that if the twin pillars or the twin towers, we might call them, of Netanyahu's revolutionary plan to bring Israel into a state of global power, one of them being the economic, technological power push, and then the other one being the multipolar geopolitical international relations push with specifically a turn to the Eastern superpowers of Russia and China, I think you got to say 9/11 is the catalyzing event for the technology economic tower, and then 11/9 is the catalyzing event for the multipolar geopolitical international relations expansion of Israel's relational power part of Netanyahu's plan. So I think that this is becoming sort of clear to me. Like I didn't quite understand the 11/9 operation as clearly as I did the 9/11 operation. It was so obvious what the some of the motive or the cui bono, you might say, of the 9/11 operation in relationship to Netanyahu specifically in his plans. And 11/9, I get it now at a bigger scale, beyond just sort of Trump policy on moving the embassy in Jerusalem and Golan Heights, and then the sort of fake peace deal, and then the announcement of the Abraham Accords and all that. There is all that, but I get it in the bigger piece of Netanyahu, specifically his political power internationally was supercharged by the 11/9 operation, partially because he was in bed with Putin and then these Middle Eastern leaders. And who knows if there's some other Chinese component to that. Just sort of thinking back to that part of the Steele dossier, and Trump being potentially even more compromised by corruption background in terms of other countries like China, where they were happy to sort of focus on the Russian component. But so I just wanted to point that out. These key catalyzing events, 9/11 and 11/9, specifically in terms of this Bibi, my story operations. All right. So we will finish up with a segment toward the end, a piece of a chapter towards the end of the book titled Parting Shot about 2016, chapter 58. But I just wanted to read a brief little section of a chapter right before that that talks about technology and relationships, technology relationships. And this, I think, should be interesting and helpful. All right, so this is page 553 of Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, "From the start, I believed that a strong economy was vital to create Israeli power and to sustain it. I now focus my efforts on rapidly expanding Israel's economic potential. There are basically two ways to expand a country's economy. You either create new products or you create new markets. Israel, I believe, could do both. In the recently liberated Israeli economy, ingenious entrepreneurs were creating new and exciting products and services. I believe the government's role should be to interfere as little as possible in their activities and aid them with tax cuts, export credit guarantees, subsidize R&D, and deregulation. I squelched overregulation by requiring government ministries to give a cost estimate and a source of funding for each new regulation, and demanded the removal of an old regulation in exchange for any new one proposed." Unquote. I just want to point I earlier said that I think that there was, in terms of the Wertheimer idea of the three stages of Zionism, that there was going to be potential blowback domestically in terms of Netanyahu's plan around that. And one other area that I think you might see this in terms of, you know, Netanyahu removing bureaucratic challenges to the free market, interfering as little possible in their activities, export credit guarantees, subsidize R&D and deregulation. That a lot of the downside of that, even to the Israeli domestic population, began to show up during COVID, actually, right? There's this Pfizer deal for the mRNA vaccines that apparently is totally compromised in terms of the Israeli population. And I believe those papers are coming out now. So people might want to look at that in terms of Netanyahu's having been brought that deal to the Israeli population. But also there was this whole scenario of Netanyahu supercharging the surveillance, and with the COVID regime in mind. The COVID surveillance then was the cyber weapons that had been primarily targeted towards the Palestinians and then folded into Israeli military intelligence cutout companies for export, and then intake into Silicon Valley companies and companies around the world, was now being deployed heavily against the Israeli domestic population, um, under the guise of COVID surveillance. All right, so I would just point out I think there's these two key COVID regime blowback scenarios that have hit Israel via Netanyahu, and even as you pointed out before, Greg, of Alex Jones talking about Netanyahu as the canary in the coal mine in terms of the Soros deep state. It first starts with Bibi, but it ends with Trump being taken down. It's also the place where
It's in the WikiLeaks.
it's also the case of the Pfizer mRNA scenario, is also where Netanyahu first lost public credibility with Alex Jones, let's say, but also Trump. Now that's, I would say, is not Alex Jones is not of good faith in any of his politics, I don't think. But I just want to point out that there is some kind of blowback here in terms of Netanyahu's push for the Chicago school liberating of the economy, as he says, I think. All right, we're in the middle of page 553 of Bibi by Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, the chief scientist's office concentrated on encouraging innovation. I gave an annual Prime Minister's Prize for Innovation and an annual prize for advances in carbon-free transportation, generously provided by the Sampson family from South Africa. Interesting. I was repeatedly invited to speak at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, where I met some of the world's greatest tech entrepreneurs. With Bill Gates, I discussed my goal of giving Israeli children who came from low-income homes access to affordable computers under a program I called, quote, a computer for every child, unquote. Gates approved of the initiative and gave the impression of being easygoing as well as eminently practical, unquote. And by the way, also well known to our apparent Israeli military intelligence operatives, the Talpiot twin Maxwell sisters, and also deep in bed with Jeffrey Epstein, our apparent Israeli military intelligence long-term compromise agent. Oh, and of course, our long-time guy, doppelganger for Alan Dershowitz, Nathan Myhrvold, chief technology officer of Microsoft. Okay. Quote, Gates approved of the initiative and gave the impression of being easygoing as well as eminently practical. Alternatively, a t-shirt clad Mark Zuckerberg, then in his 20s, struck me as unusually intense and totally focused on his mission, a man in a hurry. After meeting in Davos on one or two occasions in later years, we spoke on the phone on matters relating to internet regulations, something that as a believer in market forces and freedom of speech, I was naturally loath to do, unquote. Now, he doesn't say that he spoke on the phone as much with them as he did with Larry Silverstein in the run-up and through September 11th, but the connection was there. All right, we're at the top of page 554 of Bibi by Netanyahu. Quote, I was delighted when both Microsoft and Facebook recognized Israel's technological prowess and established vibrant R&D centers in the country. Google, Apple, and the other technological giants would do the same. Many bought Israeli companies, as did Warren Buffett, whose first acquisition outside the United States was an Israeli precision blade company named Iscar, ISCAR, established by the visionary Scott Wertheimer. When I visited Iscar's plant on a remote hill in the Galilee, I was amazed. The robotized facility was shipping precision blades to Japan. Talk about selling snow to the Eskimos, unquote. I had forgotten that we'd covered that Wertheimer's Iscar had been purchased by Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett and the 9/11 golf tournament, where apparently Bush just sort of ends up at the Air Force Base there, Omaha. Okay, I'd forgot. That was a key point. All right, back to the text. Quote: Another memorable encounter was with Elon Musk. Over breakfast at the Balfour residence in 2018, I was deeply impressed by the clarity and boldness of his vision for the future and for his plans for free speech on Twitter. No, he didn't say that, but that's what I imagine. Okay, back to the text. Quote, discussing Israel, he made some startling suggestions for developing solar energy and for revolutionizing inner city transport with novel tunnel technology that he was working on. The Boring Company. If proven practical, this could complement my vision of connecting Israel with north-south bullet trains that would eliminate the concept of periphery and would further interlink the vast network of highways and railways that we were already in the process of building. Musk, though clearly aware of his exceptional capabilities, was down to earth and spoke matter-of-factly about things he was doing that were changing the world. All these inspiring entrepreneurs clearly appreciated Israel as a force for innovation. And no wonder, with our free market policies, Israeli innovation thrived. Israel produced hundreds of agrotech startups, some specializing in precision agriculture. Why irrigate an entire field equally when you can use a drone and sensors on the ground to tell you which parts of the field is parched and which is not? Relaying this information to computerized drip irrigation systems that Israel had already developed saved water and improved yields. Sometimes agricultural innovation popped up in surprising places. My friend Shlomi Fogel, a successful entrepreneur of varied companies, developed a taste for blueberries, a fruit thought to be hard to grow in Israel. Applying ingenious technology, he built a largely robotic farm on the Golan Heights that grows blueberries and raspberries that compete with the best producers in the world. This is but one small example of ingenuity by many thousands of Israeli startups. Such inventiveness opened doors worldwide. All right, there's more there, but we'll leave that section. I just thought that we should cover that briefly.
No, that's a good idea. And hearing the stuff with Bill Gates, it's a reminder of when we were in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2019. It was the Microsoft Jedi, or the Jedi Cloud technology, and the $10 billion offered to Microsoft, and that Amazon had been basically strong-armed out of that by the Trump administration. And then in the summer of 2021, after the switching from Trump to Biden, the Jedi Cloud to Microsoft was scrapped, and so that reminded me of the big push in our one of our focuses in DC in July 2019 was bringing attention to this Jedi Cloud software, the Microsoft, the replacing of Amazon, which of course was seen as an enemy of the Trump administration, at least on the surface, with all the things going on with Saudi Arabia and Khashoggi and the Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. But that Microsoft was brought in instead for this $10 billion Jedi Cloud technology by the administration. So it reminded me of that with relation. And then you bring the this factor of Netanyahu and Myhrvold and Bill Gates into it. It just reminded me of that.
It's true. And in addition to, we actually ended up delivering flyers that Brendan O'Connell had designed and delivering them to every single branch of the U.S. military that had a liaison office in the U.S. Congress, including I gave them some context, a brief briefing on the matter. But beyond that, we also, Greg, remember, we recorded you reporting on the hearing that was going on there at the time, because we planned the trip around the Mueller hearing. We were going to be at the Mueller hearing, and then at the last minute, the Mueller hearing got pushed back. But we were already had our schedules committed and the airline tickets purchased and everything, and so we just had to go for this other time. But what was going on at that time was a very interesting hearing about a Facebook cryptocurrency called the Libra. And it turned out that the head of their Libra operation came out of these same Israeli intelligence networks, and then we reported on that meeting, and also a meeting with a hearing with the head of Department of Homeland Security. Um, and got him on video too down the hallway. That was interesting. But you reported on this question of the Libra Facebook cryptocurrency hearing at during that time too. So I'd forgotten about that, and that was also appeared to be directly tied into this whole Netanyahu operation. All right, all right. Now we'll just finish up. Now it seems like, Greg, we could. There's so much in this book. We'll have to um, get it back into our hands to search down some more details in here. But we'll just end up with
Indeed.
chapter 58, Parting Shot, 2016. Quote, 1 year earlier, I had made a very different sort of speech at the UN General Assembly. It was September 2016, and I was acutely conscious of the fact that we were a mere 4 months away from the end of Obama's term. Anticipating that the president would bring an anti-Israeli resolution to the Security Council immediately after the U.S. elections, when he would be freed of all political constraints, I wove this contingency into my speech. I first ridiculed the unchanging, reflexive, anti-Israel majorities at the UN. Well, go, Greg.
Oh, I was just going to say, remember also what was going on at the end of the administration? I believe, wasn't it the $38 billion aid guarantee that was signed, and it was seen as a monumental thing at the time? But as we're hearing here, like, that's not good enough for Netanyahu and his faction. The $38 billion alone, that's just not good enough.
And that's what he gets into. That's what this is heading into, is talking about the MOU and all of that surrounding all of this. So you're exactly prescient, Greg. All right. Page 573 of Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, I first ridiculed the unchanging, reflexive anti-Israel majorities at the UN, while the attitudes toward Israel on the part of so many of the individual states represented there had since moved on. Quote, today's automatic majority against Israel at the UN reminds me of the incredible story of Hiru Onoda, unquote, I said. I then told the story of a Japanese soldier who fought in the Philippines in World War II. Refusing to believe the war had ended, he lived in the jungle, scavenging for food, while Japanese tourists were vacationing in American-built hotels in nearby Manila. His former commanding officer finally convinced him in 1974 that he could come out of hiding and lay down his arms. I then turned to the delegates. Quote, I have one message for you today. Lay down your arms. The war against Israel at the UN is over, unquote. By then, some 20 countries that a few years earlier had supported anti-Israel resolutions no longer did so. But my main interest in that speech was to flag Obama's parting shot, which I believe was coming down the pike. Unquote. I just note the anti-Israel resolutions. It's actually, it's actually Israeli reform resolutions. And in many of these countries, not only believe that it's about the natural and human rights and national rights of the Palestinian people, that's been sat upon for 3/4 of a century, at least. But it's also about that they actually believe that this is the road to Israel becoming a normalized part of the international community. So it's not. So he's just doing the sort of Hasbara propaganda, the anti-Israel, like the UN watch. Like remember the woman, by the way, from the who had been involved with the Jewish Federation of Kansas City, Karen Pack, who had also been involved with the Jewish Agency for Israel, had met Shimon Peres. I believe she was the key contact for why Shimon Peres recorded a video specifically for the Dennis Ross event, Truman in Israel, in May of 2016 at the Kansas City Public Library. Remember, she was asking her question as I was being grabbed and dragged out of there for politically uncomfortable speech with Dennis Ross. And she said, "What can we do about the UN, the human rights, and that whole agenda?" Right? That's what her question was at that same time. So this is a Hasbara idea that, UN Watch, the UN anti-Semitism, anti-Israel, all of that, and it's really trying to reform Israel, right? What they believe is actually will be good for everyone in the long term. So I just wanted to point that out.
And as we've discussed when we talk about what we see as the types of ideas and policies that bring, say, Russia under Putin and Israel under Netanyahu, these particularly more hardline factions geopolitically and otherwise, that's one thing that if our belief as far as the looking at Israel more similar than the way we look at the U.S. in terms of that we've always talked about Israel, but that there's not just quote unquote Israel in the way that we've that it's typically discussed, but very specific factions within Israel, much like specific factions you could say within the United States, are very resistant to any type of what we see as like liberalized change in terms of becoming a normalized quote unquote member of the global community, which once again goes back to I believe, the animus that these hawkish elements hold against the idea of the quote unquote liberal world order of the post war order and all of this, and that this is very much seen by I believe, the forces around Netanyahu and these more hawkish elements as something that is anathema to their particular what they want and desire. And so I see this there's pushback here against but then a bigger, I think, more general pushback against the idea of quote unquote normalizing us to enter into your liberal world order the way you see it, Americans.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Bottom of page 573, quote, "But my main interest in that speech was to flag Obama's parting shot, which I believe was coming down the pike. Quote, 'I know there might be a storm before the calm,' I said to the delegates. 'I know there is talk about ganging up on Israel at the UN later this year. Given its history of hostility towards Israel, does anyone really believe that Israel will let the UN determine our security and our vital national interests?' Unquote. Beyond my conversation in Moscow and my hopes for a last-minute change of fortune, there was little I could do to stave off this ominous possibility. Earlier that summer, I had decided to concentrate instead on the one remaining item of business with the Obama administration, securing a memorandum of understanding for a 10-year military assistance program. The first such MOU was forged during my initial term as Prime Minister. In the wake of my speech to Congress in 1996, calling for the end of economic assistance to Israel, I negotiated with the Clinton administration a deal in which an annual $1.2 billion of economic assistance was reduced by $120 million per year for 10 years, at which point it would be done. At the same time, our $1.8 billion in annual military assistance was increased by $60 million per year, rising to $2.4 billion at the end of the 10-year period and ensuring the IDF the constancy of American support for a decade. In 2007, when this 10-year MOU was expiring, Olmert had negotiated a new 10-year program with President George W. Bush for an increased amount. The large security assistance to Israel was enthusiastically supported in Congress on both sides of the aisle. Many viewed it as a solid investment in an American ally that never asked for American troops. Oh, yeah, put aside Iraq, I guess, Bibi. Rolled back militant Islam in the heart of the Middle East, gave the U.S. incomparable intelligence, right, Ritter? And jointly developed with America the most advanced weapons. Quote, "Hell," one Southern senator told me, If we had an Israel and Afghanistan, we'd save ourselves $1 trillion and have a reliable ally against the bad guys, unquote.
I had there was a line in the Netanyahu Hoover Institute interview that he did with the head of the Hoover Institute, where I think he even played on like the senator's particular Southern accent. It made me speculate that this might have been Senator Lindsey Graham who had said this to him. I'm not sure about that, but I had thought of that. I can see him saying that. If there wasn't an Israel, we'd put it. It would be there. That quote there, just in the Lindsey Graham drawl and all that. It made me think of that.
No, it does. It sounds like the kind of thing Lindsey Graham would say too. Yeah. Yep. Interesting. Okay, bottom of page 574 of Bibi by Netanyahu. Quote, now it was my turn to seek a third MOU extension, this time with President Obama. This was one of the reasons that some of the senior IDF staff had urged me not to speak to Congress on the Iran nuclear deal, but to negotiate for a new MOU instead. Quote, no amount of money will protect us against atomic bombs, I responded. We have to resist the deal and go for the MOU later, unquote. Quote, but speaking in Congress will jeopardize the MOU, unquote, they persisted. Quote, no, it won't, unquote, I said. I thought that if anything, my confrontation with the president over the Iran deal and my public demonstration of how bad it was for Israel would lead him to extend the MOU, thus demonstrating the continuity of America's support for Israel under his administration. Some suggested waiting for the next president. I shot that one down, too. You never know who or what might come next. After some negotiations, Obama agreed to a new MOU that gave Israel $36 billion over 10 years. It was strongly supported by Congress. The MOU was signed on September 14, 2016, less than 2 months before the presidential elections. It was not the last time that I had to impose my judgment and familiarity with American politics over the advice of so-called American experts in our bureaucracy. Right? He's like, leave it to me. I'm the Sayeret Matkal agent in place over many decades in America.
I guess this is the anti-Bibi deep state in the U.S. that believes that Israel should be content enough with the constant U.S. support and the memorandums of understanding and the guarantee that Israel would still be kept as the quote-unquote only democracy in the region and all of this. And once again, when you think of the bipartisan control of, say, like Israel lobby over Congress, that there's a reason I think why Netanyahu, even if he goes in and browbeats the sitting president over nuclear diplomacy with Iran, he knows that things like memorandum of understanding aren't under threat for these reasons.
Exactly. Yep. All right, middle of page 575 of Bibi, My Story by Netanyahu. Quote, while I was in New York that same month to give my speech at the UN General Assembly, I asked to see both presidential candidates and took Ambassador Dermer with me. Hillary met us with her aide Jake Sullivan at a hotel where she was giving a speech. She was clearly focused on the debate she was about to have with Trump. Nothing annoys politicians fighting for their political lives more than a busybody who takes up their time while they're facing Judgment Day. Unquote. That is very interesting, too. He's just a busybody, huh? And it's sort of because you got to think again, parallel to all of this, the 11/9 operation, their desire to install Trump and their actions to help install Trump is already going place. So then Netanyahu is sort of summoning both Hillary Clinton and Trump right before their debate, and specifically talking about Hillary apparently, being focused on the debate, and he's just sort of interrupting her. Very interesting reconnaissance behind enemy lines there, Mr. Prime Minister. Okay. Quote, I spoke as briefly and as succinctly as I could. I knew that Hillary supported the Iran deal, so I reiterated my position briefly and instead focused on the opportunities for peace with Arab countries that I believe were opening up. Hillary nodded and seemed to recognize the possibility. Trump received Ambassador Dermer and me in his gilded apartment in Trump Tower. We had met several times over the years, and he had endorsed my candidacy for prime minister a few years earlier. He was warm, affable, and confident. By the way, yes, he was prime minister. We had identified on the list that was written in your own handwriting that he appeared to be the only non-Jewish billionaire that was a major supporter of you. And he was like the only major American figure to make a video. Well, he's definitely the only presidential candidate in 2016 to have made a candidate endorsement video for you,
Right.
Bibi.
Let's remember, it wasn't Clinton, it wasn't Bush, it wasn't anybody else. It was Donald Trump. And once again, these parallels keep popping up. Who has the most connections to credibly accused September 11th suspects? Not just politically, but business community, obviously organized crime. It's Donald Trump, and he continues to point out that like he is this is just more and more indisputable, I believe, evidence that this man is the polar opposite of everything that he's been made out to be by these fools in some cases and just obvious liars in other cases, of this image of like this anti-war, anti-Zionist, anti-deep state maverick who's going to take back the reins of the country from the people who have gotten us into endless wars and all these other problems over the decades. It's not that. It's the opposite of that. And in many ways, what he wants to bring about is worse than that. And this is just another example of this, like these connections that are so obviously there that should be clear as day for anybody to see.
Exactly. All right, top of page 576 of Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu. He, Trump, quote, didn't need much convincing about the Iran deal. Quote, that's the lousiest deal I've ever seen, he said. I'm going to get out of it, unquote. Unquote. By the way, everyone talked about Trump, the deal maker, the great businessman deal maker. He's not really a good businessman deal maker. In the vein of like pushing your interests very well while also meeting the interests of your the dealer on the other side of the table. No, Trump's way of making deals is about putting his name on things where lots of money can be laundered, where he can also then shaft contractors. That's what Trump means when he's talking about a good deal. He's looking for something where you get over on somebody in an unethical way, I would say. All right. Top of page 576 of Bibi. Quote, I agreed with that sentiment and told him so, and also repeated my belief that we could have a breakthrough for peace with several Arab countries. My confidence was not theoretical. For years, the Mossad had maintained security contracts with its counterparts in many Arab states. These relations suffered a setback with the United Arab Emirates after the targeting of the Hamas terrorist operative Mahmoud al-Mabou in Dubai in 2010. Oh, yeah, I remember that. Though the Mossad agents got out of the country, the subsequent public exposure of the Mossad's role in the operation caused a great embarrassment to the Emiratis and an enduring crisis in the ties between Israel and the UAE. I'd forgotten about that. It's the case. They even like the surveillance security camera footage had been put into the public domain of showing the Israeli operatives going in and stuff like. So it was seen as a big blow to both the UAE and Israeli intelligence. Quote, but all this began to change as the clouds of a nuclear Iran began to gather on the horizon, a sword of Damocles over the heads of the Sunni Arab states, and it became apparent that I was the only leader willing to openly oppose the deal. Tony Blair, who shuttled back and forth between the Gulf and Israel in a private capacity, lobbied to have me meet the Gulf leaders. With his help, between 2016 and 2018, Itzik Molko met with trusted representatives of the leaders from the key Gulf states, as well as Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ, president of the United Arab Emirates, and other leaders.
Tony Blair's involvement here is very interesting because then that adds a added layer of intrigue around the around Brexit and the geopolitics there. And Blair's, I believe, has been talked about by some of the more serious Twitter researchers into all things related to the geopolitics of not just the United States, but Britain and Brexit internationally, of Blair's own potential oligarchical connections. And so this opens up an interesting new layer to look at, that perhaps some people who know more about British politics and aspects than we do have perhaps already done, but it would be an interesting road for us to look at from our deep political understanding of things, potentially, that Blair is being used as this intermediary.
Yeah, and I would just point out again with these sort of twin towers of Netanyahu's catalyzing events, 9/11 and 11/9, for his twin towers of revolutionary policies. There's Blair. Blair's in key position in the UK post 9/11 in the run up to the Iraq War. And then here's Blair again in a key position in terms of the 11/9 operation. Some of it sort of before the operation is completed in terms of 11/9, the day that Trump is announced the president, and then into the Trump years. And there is Tony Blair playing a key role after these catalyzing events. Okay. Quote, Molcho arranged secret meetings with these representatives in Cyprus, in his home in Caesarea, and in the prime minister's residence in Jerusalem. Notice Cyprus. This was followed by phone calls between me and the leaders, which in turn led to secret meetings between us. We met in the Gulf several times. In one meeting, I landed in a helicopter with Molcho, who initiated the meeting on the deck of a yacht in the Red Sea. The Red Sea conspiracy, right? I decided to hold the meeting there despite concerns raised by security officials. He's referring to this. This is the part in the book where he's actually talking about what he talked about verbally in his interview. Okay. Bottom of page 576 of Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, the Arab leaders I met were smart and savvy, and we spoke openly and directly about our concern with the waning American readiness to confront Iran and its growing desire to accommodate it. We also spoke of how we would cooperate with each other militarily, economically, and diplomatically. They told me that my speech in Congress against the Iran deal and my willingness to stand up to an American president was a turning point in their willingness to strengthen ties with Israel. These meetings laid the foundations for what would ultimately be a breakthrough of historic proportions, the Abraham Accords, and the international crime that the AnteDote calls the 11/9 operation. Okay, he didn't say that. It's not in there, but it's true. Okay. Page 577. Quote, the U.S. election day arrived. 8 years earlier, I woke up to President Obama. Now I woke up to President Trump. Not yet, Bibi. My world had just changed. Remembering my conversation with Trump on the eve of the election, I realized that I would now have a great ally in my battle against Israel's greatest foe. We didn't spend a year conspiring with all of our assets in place to make it happen.
No, there weren't all these geopolitical moves being made in such a major way, combined with Benjamin Netanyahu having an entire domestic media apparatus, the Death Star, as you call it, made in America, conceived in Israel, leading the charge and its other tentacles such as the Gateway Pundit, etc., and not of course the traditional GOP, Council for National Policy networks that have long been in place to lead the way in basically destroying the political and social reputation of the Clinton family in order to make Trump happen. No. He realized overnight that he was going to have a great ally. What a load of BS.
I agree. Okay. All right, I'm going to read that again. Page 577 of Bibi by Netanyahu. Of BS by Netanyahu. Okay. Quote, my world had just changed. Remembering my conversation with Trump on the eve of the election, I realized that I would now have a great ally in my battle against Israel's greatest foe. But there were still 2 months to go before the new president took office, and I knew I would have to dodge Obama's parting shot at the UN Security Council. Quote, who will they get? Unquote, I asked Ron. Get for what? He asked. To front the anti-Israel resolution for them, I said. They'll get some country to do their bidding. Then they'll abstain and avoid applying the veto. They'll then say they didn't vote against Israel. That won't fool anyone, Ron said. Maybe not, but I'm sure that's what they'll do. And they did just that. It didn't take more than a few days for the intelligence to flow in. Two normally Israel-friendly governments let us know that they were secretly approached by the U.S. to support this hostile resolution and that they had no choice but to go along with it. American deep state warmongers. Okay. Okay. Quote, Egypt was chosen by the U.S. as the country to submit the anti-Israeli resolution at the UN Security Council. I spoke to El-Sisi, but he replied with a, quote, what can I do, shrug of the shoulders. Trump's people were powerless to help, but the president-elect did issue a statement decrying the imposition of terms by the UN and underscoring that direct negotiations were the only way forward. I knew definitively that I had lost this round. UN Security Council Resolution 2334 passed on December 23, 2016, with the U.S. abstaining. It mandated that, quote, Israel stop immediately and completely all settlement activity in the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem, unquote. In a speech at the Western Wall on the eve of Hanukkah, I ripped into the resolution. Quote, the UN resolution is twisted and shameful, but we'll overcome it. It says that the Jewish quarter is occupied. That's absurd. It says that the Western Wall is occupied territory. That is absurd, too. We reject this outright, just as we rejected the absurd resolution that equated Zionism with racism, unquote. Durban Conference residents, right?
Let's remember this is right around the same time, I believe, that in the Hanukkah holiday season that I believe it was the Chabad rabbi who lights the menorah at the White House every year, who I believe is also Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump's rabbi, who laid into Obama, I believe, prior to the White House menorah lighting ceremony. So I just want to throw that in there as well.
Wow. Interesting. Page 578 of Bibi by Netanyahu. Quote, to express Israel's consternation, I called our ambassadors to New Zealand and Ukraine back, as those countries had joined Egypt in sponsoring the resolution, cut back support for Senegal, which had voted for it, and suspended Israel's annual membership fee payment to 5 UN bodies. New Zealand and Ukraine. Very interesting. Okay. Quote, Prime Minister, don't you think you're overreacting, unquote, asked a foreign ministry official. Quote, not in the least. This is merely a prelude to the real thing, unquote, I said. I had received word that in the final months remaining until the inauguration of the new U.S. president, a new and even harsher Security Council resolution was being prepared. This one would be a binding resolution calling on Israel to withdraw to the 1967 lines and establishing a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. In an unusual phone call that Obama made to a sympathetic Israeli journalist on October 14th, 2016, this is what I think, Greg, this is what was being referred to in those articles that we found. Back to the text. 3 weeks before, quote, in an unusual phone call that Obama made to a sympathetic Israeli journalist on October 14th, 2016, 3 weeks before the presidential election, he may have been speaking of this possible resolution. Quote, before I leave office, Obama told the journalist, I would like to bring a resolution to the UN Security Council that would set parameters for Israeli-Palestinian peace, stating the guidelines for the principle of a peace agreement, a Palestinian state, the final status of Jerusalem, and overall permanent borders based on the 1967 lines, unquote. I communicated to Moscow my extreme disappointment with Russia's vote on the previous resolution. Quote, we hear you, unquote, was the answer I received. I was not disappointed again. The second resolution never materialized. End of section. And there's more to this chapter, but it talks more about his disagreement with Obama and everything. And so do we have an answer to why it didn't, I still don't remember ever finding out why it didn't quite materialize?
That's a great question. I guess this is when we're going to wrap it up here, but I wanted to throw in one more thing that we didn't read that I thought was pretty instructive and telling was I believe it was at the funeral of Shimon Peres where it was then Secretary of State John Kerry told Netanyahu basically, if you want to have a funeral like this, then you need to basically get in line. I'm paraphrasing, but I thought that was very interesting. Netanyahu played it off in the book like, oh, well, I wasn't worried about my funeral. I was worried about Israel's funeral. But I thought that was very telling then when you consider Biden coming into office and the former quote unquote diplomat, Aaron David Miller, basically telling Netanyahu, you're not in Kansas anymore. You're going to wait in line to meet Biden because, it's not everybody's not just going to kowtow to you anymore is basically what I read it as. So I thought that quote from John Kerry about if you want a funeral like Perez is getting with the state funeral and all the American dignitaries here and the way it's being treated, then you better basically step in line. I thought that was paraphrasing. I thought that was pretty instructive and telling.
Very much so. So I think we probably will have to return to this book a little bit in the future, once I can get it back, and then maybe you can get access to a copy, because there's a lot of stuff here that helps flesh out the structure of our analysis, I would think, and it's very telling. And so, all right, I'm glad we got through some of these bits and pieces from Bibi, My Story by Benjamin Netanyahu. All right. Thank you very much, Greg.
Thank you, Jeremy.
And thank you, everybody. We appreciate you. Until next time, AnteDote, we are out.